To see mankind reduced to such a state, rodent-like, fearful and small, is humbling. Man is no hunter here. He is prey. Skull Island's coast was a savage war-front between land and sea. Heavy oceanic swells buffeted the shattered coast, eating rocks and ruins alike, leaving a jagged shoreline like a jaw of broken teeth. On the western flank, the sea crashed against the sheer cliffs and shard-like escarpments. Ancient ruins wound through the cracks in the rock, soulless atriums echoing with the pounding of the waves. Seabirds made their homes here in the myriad cuts and ledges, resident gulls and seasonal migrants. Petrels, gannets, and cormorants dived for fish in the rich, cold waters of the trench that abutted the land. By the 20th century, the few humans that lived on Skull Island scraped a living on this barren shore, their village perched on a thin sliver of rock jutting into the sea, beyond the warding Great Wall. On the far side of the island, a slow sinking brought the sea gradually inland. Where once lowland forest and floodplains stretched, the high tides drowned the land. There were a few beaches in the more sheltered inlets between the rocky headlands. These were transitory homes of fur seals and sea turtles. Patrolled by huge predators and scavengers alike, these inlets were every bit as foreboding as the western cliff to the human inhabitants. Some of the most prolific inhabitants of these coasts were the crustaceans. The osteodomus is going to be the first one that I talk about. Crawling over rocks and flitting through tidal pods, there were many varied crustaceans. Copepods, woodlice, shrimp, crabs, crayfish, and countless others. Most were familiar species, but Skull Island has its oddballs too. Not the least amongst them, the chunky hermit crab, Osteodomus. Large for a hermit, the biggest individuals had extreme difficulty locating shells of sufficient size to fit. Innovative little opportunists, they made use of absolutely anything that even vaguely fit the bill, including hollowed bones, giving the species the name. It was not uncommon to see a seal skull scuttling over the rocks with spiky legs protruding on the shore. The next entry was a direct competitor to Osteodomus, and was also known as Scudicaris, or the shield crab. Scudicaris was a flattened lobster from the Celeridae family, including slipper and Spanish-nosed lobsters. Scudicaris was extreme even amongst these squished-looking crustaceans, with its almost two-dimensional body designed to allow it to slip into even the smallest of cracks and splits in the rocks of the shoreline. Predatory fish and octopi could be evaded by hiding in the narrow fissures that were common amongst the shattering coastline. Scudicaris also hunted in these cracks, hauling out small prey that would have been evaded by most crabs or lobsters of similar sizes. The crustacean was omnivorous, taking anything it came across. The sharp-bladed claws could pry open bivalves and snip the muscle that held the two halves shut to get at the fleshy shellfish inside. The Kune predator, or nest plunderer, was a stocky little land crab unlike any other. Burly Kune predator was a remarkable little creature. Having forsaken the water, it ranged the coastal cliffs and the borders of the jungle. Kune predator had also developed adaptations to live entirely free of the sea, not having to return to the water to breed. Carrying fertilized eggs in a special cavity beneath the body, females kept their precious charges moist and safe as they developed, hatching into tiny versions of their adult form. The larval stage was entirely skipped. The tiny crabs clung to their parent for the first days or weeks of their life, crawling over her shell and down her limbs to feed, but never leaving the safety of her body. The mother crab would seek out one of the many seabird colonies that dotted the island's cliff-bordered shoreline and deposit her young there, removing them from her body by brushing against litter or delicately brushing them with her pincers. In the nest, the young would grow quickly, consuming detritus and leftover seabird meals or remains of dead nestlings. Once the birds fledged and the nest was abandoned, the half-grown young crabs moved off to join their parents in the jungle fringe as free-roaming scavengers. Kune predator was also remarkable for having a second large pair of pincers. Amongst females, the second pair was just another tool for foraging, but their real function became apparent during the mating season when the males would use them to grapple with females in an apparent dance. On to my personal favorite coastal heavyweight, we have the Tartarosaurus, or the cruel hell lizard. The largest of the coastal predators, Tartarosaurus was a terror that naive foraging sorties prayed they would never run into. Huge and hungry, with bone-cracking jaws and powerful limbs that could propel the carnivore faster than any man could run for short distances, this brute could make short work of any unwary villagers. Fortunately, its range was limited to the far side of the island, where it subsisted mainly on seals, coastal reptiles, and limosauruses. Tartarosaurus also took carrion when it could find it, possessing strength to fight off other meat-eaters from their food. This carnivore's ability to stand on its hind limbs permitted it to reach low cliff-nesting birds, too, raiding their nests for eggs and chicks, little more than tiny snacks for this tank-like reptile. The seasonal nature of many of the coastal food sources, such as fur seals, meant Tartarosaurus were mainly nomadic, following their food. This brought them into frequent conflict with one another when individuals met over kills. Large fat reserves accumulated in their tails, allowing the species to go without feeding for extremely long periods. This stored energy would grant smaller animals with some reprieve in the battle to compete for survival when food was scarce. Tartarosaurus had a thick rhinoceros-like hide that protected it from most harm. Males fought each other for resources and access to females. Armed with thick curved claws in each forelimb, males battled upright, balancing on their sturdy hind legs while they raked each other with these scythe-like claws. Depending on the ferocity of their matches, their thick hides and resilient scales usually protected them from most serious injury. Parasidon was a 12 to 16 foot long theropod. A long snout armed with rows of thin-bladed teeth identified Parasidon as a fish-eater, though it readily took seabirds, eggs, and even unguarded seal pups when the opportunity presented. A specialized theropod, the elegant wader stalked the perimeters of the island, gripping the rocks with vice-like claws. Even heavy surf didn't deter it. Parasidon could strike quickly with its long foreclaws or gin-trap snout to snatch prey out of the shoreline pool and along the water's edge. A long tail balanced Parasidon as it clung in the splash pool. Keen eyes pierced the waves to reveal fish and crabs. Equally at home in the calm or thrashing seas, Parasidon were found all along the shoreline, from the surf-punished and crumbling reefs to the quiet coastal swamps. The lemursaur was a 2 to 3 foot long inhabitant of the coast. Clinging to the spray-lash rocks with its broad, clawed feet was the peculiar salamander-like lemursaur. Flabby amphibians, remarkably adapted to survive in the salty water, lemursaurs grazed the splash stone, scraping mussels and other shellfish from the rocks with their stone-hard teeth. The pudgy oddballs tore the entire shellfish loose from its anchorage in bunches and swallowed the shardy pulp, shell and all. Tough-walled guts protected them from the bite of the shells as it passed through. Skull Island's temperamental geology rendered its coast a crumbling maze of cliffs and promontories jutting out and over a savage sea. The jagged projections provided protected ledges for the seabirds and other wildlife to nest upon, and precipitous lookouts for predators to scan for prey below. There were few beaches on the island's coast, so competition was for sure fierce. The first inhabitant of these cliffs that I'm going to talk about is the dragon-skin monitor. At 2 to 3 feet long, these were striking lizards that recently colonized the island, but had evolved into an entirely new species. Having likely arrived on rafts of vegetation or driftwood from somewhere in Southeast Asia, they developed brilliant red scales that were even more vivid in the breeding season. The precise function of these markings is not clear, though it may have been to startle predators. Both sexes were brightly colored. Dragon skins fed primarily on eggs and small creatures that they found along the rocky shore and on the cliffs that they nimbly climbed. The discus ora, or the coast discus, was a 4 to 6 inch long species of flying lizard that made its home on the rocky shore. Pretty green and yellow lizards, they took their name from the round wings. These enabled them to make short, quick flights between rocks in pursuit of insects and to avoid the gulls that preyed on them frequently. On the eastern shores of Skull Island, where the rivers flowed down into the sea and the land was slowly sinking, much of what had once been floodplains or low jungle was now drowned in a growing swamp. Where once low forests grew adjacent to the river, instead tide-flooded swamps lay, punctuated only by the stumps of choked trees. Aciodactylus mandocaris was a 12 to 15 foot long shellfish eater that roamed the swampy estuaries and mangroves. Broad, splayed toes and feet kept the dinosaur from sinking into the sodden mud and sand, but its most peculiar adaptation was the second pair of nostrils mounted atop of its triangular nasal crests. Aciodactylus's primary nostrils could pinch shut when exhaling, forcing air into the resonating crests and small secondary nostrils to trumpet calls to one another. The main function of these secondary nostrils became clear during feeding. Sealing the primaries, Aciodactylus could breathe through the high-mounted secondaries while most of its head was down below in the shallow water or mud of the estuary, grabbing for shellfish. Its teeth were short and thick for crushing mollusks and crab shells alike. This placid theropod instead defended itself with long blade-like claws on its fingers, flexing and brandishing them at potential threats to warn them away in favor of any direct conflict. Nefundosaurus acerbus was a 16 to 24 foot long, brutish, four-legged heavyweight with a taste for flesh. Nefundosaurus was not a dinosaur, but an ancient archosaur, a group that predated dinosaurs. Its huge olfactory canal afforded the animal an acute sense of smell. The majority of its diet was decaying fish or other tide-stranded carrion, which Nefundosaurus was led to by ribbons of rot wafting to its nostrils on the breeze. Nefundosaurus also used its size to steal meals from smaller carnivores, including the coastal crocodilian Dirosuchus or the dire crocodile, through intimidation and brute force. With powerful jaws, they were capable of wolfing down carcasses whole. Even robust shellfish and turtles could be cracked down and swallowed, digested later in the reptile's incredibly acidic stomach. Live prey was taken when it could be caught. Fat-rich seals were ambushed from behind cover on the rocky shore quite frequently. Precariously perched between the Great Wall and the furious sea, Skull Island's human inhabitants clung to a meager existence on a barren wedge of black rock crushed by eroding architecture of its past inhabitants. Between these hollow reminders of a glory of an ancient and nameless culture, the poverty-stricken islanders act out what living they could against incredible odds. Beyond the wall, an island of savage fauna awaited, with claws and teeth sharpened to rend what flesh dare come over the divide. Behind the village, the unforgiving sea claimed its own quota of humanity. Life was hard and grim, but there was food to be found by the bold. The ocean had food to offer in the form of rich sea life, though the natives had to brave death to snatch it from the waves. The ingenuity of the people was pitted against the full force of the elements and nature's most frightening monsters. Moving around the broken coast above the tide, pole-vaulting men leapt from rock to plumb new fishing grounds. The flooded arches of old halls and temples, uninhabited since the time of the ancients, sheltered hidden colonies of anemones and crabs ready to be plundered. Tethered to their friends, fishermen chose moments of calm to dive for shellfish and seaweed. Calling upon ingenuity and bravado, the natives created dizzy scaffolds of blackwood and scrappy yarn to bridge yawning gaps between abutments of stone and splintered ruins, opening new foraging grounds for exploitation. So stretched for resources, this tested people let nothing go to waste. Competition was intense, and that which another had could sometimes be taken by force. The will of the strong ruled all amongst the coast. And honestly, that phrase right there sums up Skull Island in probably the best way possible. The strong rules over all. Kong is king, but there are so many dangerous inhabitants that it's surprising a people could even take up refuge in such a dangerous place. Shout out to Weta Workshop for this absolute masterpiece of a book. I mean, it provides such an incredible insight into a world that's otherwise just grazed over in the movie. And until the next video, thanks again for watching. See you next time.